The morning Frank Calloway died, the sky over Crestfall, Montana, was the color of a bruised peach, pink and gold, and quietly violent at the edges, the kind of sky that makes old men stop what they're doing and just look up for a moment as if they know something is ending. Frank didn't look up. He was already bent over the chopping block behind the cedar cabin, the same block he had used for 31 years. Its surface worn smooth and dark with the memory of 10,000 mornings just like this one. The axe rose and fell in that easy, rhythmic way that belongs only to men who have done a thing so many times that the body no longer needs to ask the mind for permission. Rise, fall. The clean, hard crack of seasoned oak splitting along its grain. The satisfying thud of two halves tumbling to the frost hardened ground. Rise, fall, crack. Margaret Calloway, Meg to everyone who had ever known her longer than 5 minutes, was standing at the kitchen window with a cup of black coffee, warming both palms, watching him the way she had watched him every October morning for 42 years. She wasn't watching out of worry. She was watching out of habit and love and something that doesn't quite have a name. That particular attentiveness a person develops for the one thing in the world they cannot imagine doing without. The axe rose. It did not fall. Frank's left hand released the handle first. Then his knees folded slowly, almost gracefully, the way tall timber goes down when the last cut is made, not collapsing, but surrendering. He was on the ground before the axe had finished its arc, before the echo of his last clean split had faded from the tree line. Meg was through the back door before the coffee cup hit the kitchen floor. She ran the 40 feet across frozen grass in her wool socks, and she knelt beside him, and she pressed two fingers to the side of his neck, and she said his name once, just once, quietly, because she was not the kind of woman who repeated herself, and she understood. The paramedics from Ravalli County arrived 47 minutes later. They were professional and kind and entirely too late. Massive coronary, they told her standing in her kitchen with their hats in their hands, the way men do when there's nothing useful left to say. Instantaneous. He wouldn't have felt a thing. Meg thanked them and showed them out and washed the coffee cup off the kitchen floor and sat down in Frank's rocking chair by the wood stove and did not move for a very long time. She did not cry. Not because she didn't feel it. She felt it the way you feel. The ground disappear under your foot on a dark staircase, that sudden lurching, full body understanding that everything you thought was solid is not. But because Meg Calloway had always processed her grief the way Frank processed a problem, quietly, thoroughly, with her hands. The funeral was small and honest. Frank had wanted it that way. No fuss, no flowers that cost more than a week's groceries. No one standing at a podium using words like legacy and beloved, when simpler words like good man and showed up would do the job better. The Methodists came and the people from the hardware co-op and Colt Dawson from the county roads department who had plowed their driveway every winter for 15 years without ever once being asked twice. And the neighbors came, of course. Clifton Hargrave arrived in his silver Range Rover wearing a charcoal wool overcoat that cost more than most people's monthly mortgage. He was 54 years old, tall and angular, with the kind of jaw and silver hair that looked like it had been designed specifically for courtrooms and corporate boardrooms. He had been a partner at a Seattle litigation firm for 20 years before buying the Ridge property as a weekend retreat that had gradually almost accidentally become a full-time residence. He shook Meg's hand at the door with the confident, measured grip of a man accustomed to being the most capable person in any room, and he said the right words. He always said the right words, and then he stood near the back of the room with a glass of water and looked subtly, professionally uncomfortable, the way wealthy men do at other people's grief. Delphine Howell came with a casserole dish and a phone she kept checking in her coat pocket. She was 52, the head librarian at Crestfall Public Library, with quick brown eyes that missed nothing, and a conversational style that could best be described as aggressively curious. She hugged Meg for slightly too long and said things like, "You poor thing," and "You must be devastated," and "I cannot imagine." And behind every word was the bright, attentive gleam of a woman who was already composing the story she would tell later. Orrin Briggs shuffled in last alone, moving carefully on the icy front path with the deliberate focus of a man who has learned that a fall at 78 is not a minor inconvenience, but a potential catastrophe. He had been Crestfall's postmaster for 31 years, had delivered mail to this cabin in every kind of weather the Rockies could manufacture, and had known Frank Calloway since before the cedar cabin existed. He took Meg's hand in both of his and held it for a moment without saying anything, and that wordless pressure communicated more than everything else that was said in that room combined. And down at the far end of the property line, Jasper and Nora Whitfield stood together near the fence, not quite close enough to knock on the door. They were 30 years old, had moved to the base of the ridge 6 months ago, still in the tentative, slightly awkward phase of being new to a place where everyone else had decades of context. They left a covered pie dish on the porch step and left a note and drove back down the hill. They were considerate people who understood when they were peripheral to someone else's story. Meg saw the pie dish from the window. She made a note to thank them. Then she went back to Frank's rocking chair, and the cabin grew dark around her, and she sat in the dark for a while and she thought. 3 weeks after the funeral, on the first morning of November, the hammering started. It began at dawn, a sharp, rhythmic, purposeful sound that echoed off the Douglas firs and rolled down the ridge like a drum beat cutting through the cold air with the particular insistence of someone who is not building cautiously or experimentally, but with absolute decided commitment. Clifton Hargrave heard it from his kitchen while his espresso machine ran its warming cycle. He dismissed it as porch repair. Delphine Howell heard it from her bedroom and wrote it off as grief behavior. She had read enough library books on bereavement to feel medically qualified to diagnose it from a quarter-mile away. Orrin Briggs, whose small house sat closest to Meg's north property line, heard it and felt something different. Not alarm, not amusement, but the particular alertness of a man who has spent decades learning to pay attention to things other people walk past. By the end of the first week, it was clear that Meg was not repairing the porch. The lumber deliveries had started mid-October, while Frank's grave marker was still being cut. Corrugated tin sheets, rolls of heavy vapor, barrier 2x4, framing lumber, reinforced plexiglass panels, industrial grade weather stripping boxes of galvanized screws. Hanson's Hardware in Missoula had run almost entirely out of discounted corrugated tin because Margaret Calloway had bought most of it. The deliveries arrived in flatbed trucks that struggled up the ridge road, and the drivers looked at the cedar cabin and looked at Meg, a 67-year-old woman in her dead husband's oversized flannel shirt. Her gray hair pulled back with a rubber band sawdust already on her forearms. At 8 in the morning, and they unloaded without comment because there is a particular quality of purpose in some people that discourages commentary. Meg was building a shell around her house. That was the only accurate way to describe it. She had designed a lean-to shed that attached directly to the roofline of the cedar cabin and sloped downward and outward, creating an enclosed perimeter corridor approximately 10 feet wide that ran completely around all 4 sides of the structure. From the outside, as the weeks progressed and the framework filled in with corrugated tin, reclaimed barnwood, thick plastic sheeting, and rough-cut lumber, the effect was startling. The once handsome cedar cabin was disappearing inside a sprawling, mismatched outer shell that looked depending on who you asked. Like a very ambitious storage project or a very dramatic mental breakdown. The people of Crestfall, Montana mostly landed on the second interpretation. Clifton Hargrave drove up to the property line on a Saturday in mid November, parking the Range Rover on the shoulder of the Ridge Road and leaning on the split rail fence with his arms crossed. He watched Meg on the roof of the new outer structure, moving along the ridgeline with a speed and confidence that surprised him. She was not tentative up there, not careful the way people are when they're doing something beyond their ability. She was fast, efficient. She had done this before, or something like it, and it showed. He called up to her. Meg came down the ladder without rushing, pulled off one work glove, and stood facing him, with the hammer still in her other hand. He told her what he saw, the mismatched materials, the blocked windows, the chaotic appearance of the thing, with the precise, organized language of a man who had spent decades framing arguments for courtrooms. He was not unkind. He was worse than unkind. He was reasonable and concerned and slightly condescending in that very specific way that wealthy, capable men are when they have decided that someone else needs to be redirected for their own good. He mentioned property aesthetics. He mentioned the opinions of mutual acquaintances. He suggested gently that perhaps she might consider speaking with someone a professional. He said carefully, as if the word itself were fragile. Because grief does things to people, and there was no shame in it. And, Frank would have wanted Meg looked at him. Not through him, and not past him, but directly at him with the clear, still attention of a woman who has edited out everything in the world except the one thing in front of her. She said, "Come inside, Clifton." He followed her through the outer door of the new structure into the corridor between the shell and the cabin, and what he found inside stopped his careful speech entirely. The space was 10 feet wide and ran the full perimeter of the cabin. Against the outer tin wall, the beginning of a wood stack, densely packed, tightly interlocked, seasoned oak and fir, rose from the floor toward the roof. The inner wall was the original cedar cabin, solid and tight. Between them, the air was still and dry and faintly warm, radiating from the cabin's walls the way a body radiates heat under covers on a cold night. On the interior wall of the cabin, mounted at eye level just inside the corridor, was a large whiteboard. Written on it in Meg's clean, precise handwriting were 6 names. Below each name in smaller script were notes. Clifton Hargrave, Cathedral. Ceiling heat loss upward. Generator regulator exposed to north wind. Firewood stored uncovered east face. No manual heat source. Orrin Briggs, electric baseboard only. No fireplace. Single pane north window. Circulatory condition, cold exposure risk. Delphine Howell. Fireplace. South wall, decorative only. Negative draft history. Pipes north face insulated poorly. Jasper and Nora Whitfield. New construction, modern ceiling propane. Tank location, east yard, accessible. Nora, medical background noted, and at the bottom of the board underlined once 6 people. 6 places. 1 cold. Clifton stood in front of that board for a long moment. The hammer smell of fresh cut wood and the particular cold, clean scent of pine resin moved around him in the still air of the corridor. He read his own entry twice. Meg was watching him. "I'm not building this for me, Clifton," she said quietly, the way someone states a fact that requires no further supporting argument. "I'm building it for you. I'm building it." Clifton's face moved through several expressions. The condescending concern settled back into something harder to name, a kind of stillness that happens when a very smart person encounters information that doesn't fit the framework they've been using. He stood there a moment longer. Then he put his gloves back on and left. He did not tell anyone about the whiteboard, not immediately. But the sentence stayed with him in a way that courtroom arguments rarely did, pressing against the back of his thoughts at odd hours during the long silences of a large empty house. The following week, Delphine Howell arrived with a casserole and a fully operational set of eyes. She stepped into the corridor with the casserole dish extended in front of her, like a peace offering, taking in the wood stacks, the dry air, the framing, the vapor barrier sealed tight at every junction. She talked while she looked. She always talked while she looked, saying things about isolation and darkness, and Henry not wanting this. And Meg took the casserole with polite and final hands and looked at Delphine with the same clear, still attention she had turned on Clifton. Meg said, "Check your chimney draft, Delphine. The south fireplace has a reverse flow problem. In heavy wind, it won't vent. It'll fill the room." Delphine blinked. "What?" "I tested it last spring when I was helping you hang the curtain rod in the living room, and the candle on the mantel blew sideways. There's a pressure differential when the wind runs from the northwest. You'll want to know that before you need it." Delphine left with the empty casserole dish and went directly to the Crestfall diner, where she told 4 people that Meg Calloway had gone completely around the bend and was living in a self-constructed bunker and monitoring everyone on the ridge like some kind of doomsday librarian. The story spread the way stories spread in small Montana towns, fast and with creative embellishment at every telling. By the end of the week, people were driving up the ridge road just to look at the widow's project slowing down as they passed, craning their necks. Some of them took photographs. Some of them laughed. A few of them just looked quietly, without laughing, the way people look at things that unsettle them without knowing quite why. Orrin Briggs did not drive up to gawk. He walked the way he had always walked, the ridge road slowly and deliberately, in his heavy canvas work boots on a gray afternoon when the air tasted like iron and the shadows under the trees were already winter dark. He knocked on the outer door of the new structure. Meg let him in. He stood in the corridor for a long time, running one weathered hand along the face of the wood stack. He pressed his palm flat against a tier of stacked oak and felt the slight warmth embedded in the dry grain. He looked at the vapor barrier, the reinforced overhead, framing the plexiglass light panels Meg had installed near the roofline to allow in what light there was. He looked at the whiteboard on the inner wall and found his own name and read the notes beside it without any change in his expression. "Frank teach you this?" Orrin asked finally. "Some of it," Meg said. "Some of it I figured out on my own." Orrin nodded. He stayed another hour drinking coffee at Meg's kitchen table, and they talked about winters. They remembered the freeze of 1989, the blizzard of 1996 that had knocked out power to the northern half of Ravalli County for 9 days. The way certain autumns had a smell and a texture to them that the old ranchers called a deep cold year. They talked about woolly bear caterpillars, which Meg had been watching since September. Every one she had found on the ridge this year was entirely black, no brown banding at all, which the old-timers read as a sign of severe winter ahead. They talked about the elk who had come down from the higher elevations 3 weeks earlier than usual, their coats thick and dense, in a way that Orrin, who had watched elk for 30 years, said he had not seen in a long time. When Orrin left, he paused at the outer door and looked back at the corridor. The dry wood, the still air, the solid framing. "You going to have room in here?" he asked. 6 cots, Meg said. 6 sleeping bags, enough rations for 8 days. Orrin looked at her for a moment, then he nodded once and walked back down the hill. The 10-core delivery arrived from the sawmill the last week of November. A convoy of 2 flatbed trucks carrying seasoned oak and fir stacked in bundles, bone dry from 18 months of shed storage. The delivery crew, two brothers in their 30s who had been cutting and hauling timber since high school, watched Meg direct the unloading with the focused efficiency of a general positioning artillery, and they stacked where she told them to stack, and they drove away without the usual small talk because something in her manner made small talk feel inappropriate. Meg spent 3 full days stacking the wood inside the corridor. She did not simply pile it. Every tier was interlocked, every course offset from the one below it. Each log turned with its grain running inward so that the densest face of the wood formed the outer surface of the wall. She worked from first light until the valley went dark, and she worked alone, and the work steadied her, the way physical work steadies certain kinds of people, not by making them forget what they're grieving, but by giving the grief a container, a form, a weight that can be managed. On the last evening of the stacking, she stood in the completed corridor and looked at what she had made. The outer wall, floor to ceiling, 8 feet high, and running the full perimeter, was solid timber, dense enough to stop a wind that would bend a telephone pole, dry enough to burn at the touch of a match. Behind it, 3 feet of still air, enclosed and undisturbed by the wind that was already beginning to find its teeth in the canyon above the ridge. And behind that, the cedar cabin itself, tight and solid, its walls no longer exposed to the open sky. She walked the corridor slowly, her wool slippers quiet on the plank floor. She counted the cots rolled tight and stacked against the inner wall. She checked the supply bins. Rations, first aid, water, purification tablets, extra flannel wool blankets, battery lanterns, carbon monoxide detectors mounted above the ventilation ports. She checked the connections between the corridor's ventilation pipes and the cabin's main chimney draft, ensuring airflow. She checked the propane camp stove under its custom metal exhaust hood. She checked everything twice, the way Frank had always checked everything twice, because he had taught her that preparation is not what you do the day before a thing happens, but what you do on every ordinary day before it. In the last week of November, before the first hard snow of the season settled over the ridge, Meg walked to each of her neighbors' mailboxes in the early morning before anyone was up and slipped a sealed envelope through the slot of each one. Inside each envelope was a single sheet of paper, handwritten clean and legible in Meg's direct and unpretentious style. It covered the basics of staying alive without power in sub-zero temperatures, body heat management, the danger of carbon monoxide from improvised heating, how to recognize hypothermia in someone else, why wet clothing kills faster than cold air, why modern open-plan architecture loses heat catastrophically without forced air circulation. At the bottom of each letter underlined, once, if the grid goes down, the light on the ridge will be on. Come up. Then she went home and had her coffee and listened to the wind picking up in the Douglas firs above the cabin and felt, for the first time since October, something close to peace. In the first 2 weeks of December, the weather made Meg look foolish. The temperatures were mild, the sky was blue and cooperative. The Channel 8 meteorologist in Missoula stood in front of his green screen every evening with the easy confidence of a man whose profession had given him a complicated relationship with humility, and he pointed at his maps and talked about a ridge of high pressure dominating the region and the likelihood of a green Christmas for the valleys and maybe a dusting, he said, a light dusting for the higher elevations. Clifton Hargrave made a point of this. He drove his Range Rover along the Ridge Road on a Saturday afternoon with the window rolled down despite the cold, the way men do when they want to look casual and deliberate simultaneously. And as he passed Meg's property, the sprawling, ugly, magnificent outer shell, now fully assembled, the corrugated tin gleaming dully in the flat December light. He slowed almost to a stop, and he looked at Meg, who was splitting a single practice piece of cedar on the chopping block, and he raised his hand and extended his thumb upward with a slow, unmistakable deliberateness, and then he drove on. Meg watched the Range Rover until its tail lights disappeared around the bend. She set another piece of cedar on the block. She split it cleanly down the grain. She stacked both halves against the outer wall and stood for a moment with her hands on the axe handle, looking west where the sky above the canyon had begun, very gradually to change color, a deepening in the blue, a subtle bruising at the horizon, the kind of atmospheric shift that only becomes visible when you have spent enough time looking at the sky to know what its ordinary colors are. The barometer inside the cabin hallway had dropped 0.2 of an inch since morning. Meg picked up the axe and went back inside. She did not tell anyone what the barometer said. There was no one left to tell who would have listened, and she had made her peace with that weeks ago. Around the same time, she had made her peace with everything else she could not change. She sat in Frank's rocking chair and put one more log on the wood stove and watched the fire through the cast iron door glass and thought about the winter of 1989 when Frank had stood at the same window and looked at the same color in the west and said to her quietly, without alarm, his coffee cup warm in both hands, "It's coming, Meg. Get the extra cord in tonight." She had gotten the extra cord in. She had always gotten the extra cord in. Outside the ridge, wind picked up moving through the Douglas firs with a sound like water over stones. Somewhere down the valley, one of Clifton Hargrave's decorative outdoor Christmas lights blinked against the darkening sky. LED blue and entirely cheerful, blazing its small, confident light against a sky that was no longer the right color for confidence. Meg looked at the barometer one more time. The needle had not stopped moving. She banked the stove, checked the corridor, door seals, confirmed the ventilation ports were clear, and pulled the heavy curtains across the western windows. Then she sat back down in Frank's rocking chair and folded her hands in her lap and waited with the particular stillness of a person who has done everything that can be done and now simply trusts the work. The night outside was quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that precedes things, and Meg Calloway, who had lived on this ridge for 42 years and had learned from a man who read the land like a language, knew the difference between silence and the held breath before the storm. She knew it the way she knew his voice, the way she knew the sound of an axe rising and not falling. The barometer in Meg Calloway's hallway had an ivory face and a brass needle, and had hung on the same nail beside the coat rack for 31 years. Frank had bought it at an estate sale in Billings the year they finished the cabin, paying $12 for it from a box of miscellaneous objects on a folding table. And he had calibrated it against the National Weather Service readings every season until he trusted it more than he trusted the television. He said a barometer was honest in a way that forecasters were not, because it had no audience to reassure and no advertiser to keep happy. It simply told you what the atmosphere was doing. On the morning of December 14th, the needle was doing something Meg had never seen it do in 31 years of watching. It was falling the way a stone falls, not drifting, not declining, but dropping with a velocity that made the movement visible in real time if you stood and watched it. She had checked it at 6 in the morning when she rose to bank the stove and the reading was already low. She checked it again at 8, and the needle had moved a full quarter inch further into the range that the printed scale on the face labeled in small faded text "Stormy." By 10 o'clock, it had passed stormy entirely and was pressing into blank ivory below the printed scale into territory the instrument's maker apparently had not thought it necessary to label, because no one who understood barometers would need a label to understand what that meant. Meg stood in the hallway for a long moment, with her coffee going cold in her hand. Then she went into the corridor, walked the full perimeter, checking every seal and every vent. Confirmed that the exterior door crossbar was seated properly in its iron brackets, and came back inside and put 3 extra logs on the wood stove and filled every large pot and stock pot she owned with water from the tap and set them on the kitchen floor. By noon, the sky above Crestfall had turned a color that had no clean name in ordinary language. Not gray, not purple. Something between them, a bruised, pressurized darkness that seemed to sit lower than sky, should sit as if the atmosphere itself were leaning down. The wind in the Douglas firs above the ridge had changed register. All morning it had been the familiar high whisper of ordinary mountain wind moving through needles. Now it was something deeper and more physical, a sustained resonant pressure, like a note held too long on a pipe organ, the kind of sound that the body registers before the ears fully process it. At 2 in the afternoon, the first sleet arrived. It came horizontally, driving hard from the northwest, with the focus intensity of something that has traveled a very long distance without anything getting in its way. It hit the corrugated tin of Meg's outer shell with a sound like static, a dense, continuous hiss that filled the corridor when she opened the inner door to listen. The tin held. The framing did not flex. The vapor barrier at every seam kept the driving moisture out. She closed the inner door and went back to the wood stove and put the kettle on. At 4:15 in the afternoon, a Douglas fir 3 miles down the valley, 100 feet of old growth, ice, loaded past its tolerance, snapped at the base with a crack that people as far as Crestfall proper later described as sounding like a rifle shot. It fell across the main transmission lines, feeding the entire ridge. The failure cascaded through 3 relay stations in under 4 seconds. Every light on the ridge went out at once. Meg was standing at the kitchen counter when it happened, and the transition from electric light to darkness was so complete and so instantaneous that for one moment the world simply ceased to have edges. Then her eyes adjusted to the orange glow of the wood stove through the cast iron door glass, and she crossed the kitchen by memory and opened the fireside drawer and took out the box of long matches and the first of her kerosene lanterns. And she had the lantern lit and hanging from its hook on the ceiling beam. Before the silence left by the absent electrical hum had fully registered, she stood in the warm, steady amber light of the lantern and listened. Outside, the wind had found its full voice. It was not the sound of wind anymore. It was the sound of something that had decided to be wind entirely without reservation or restraint. It struck the outer tin shell in waves, each gust arriving like a physical body throwing itself against the structure, and the structure answered each blow with a low drumming resonance that moved through the floorboards and into the soles of Meg's wool slippers. But the cabin itself, behind its 10 feet of dead air and its wall of dense dry timber, was quiet. The temperature in the living room read 72 degrees on the wall thermometer. Meg put the kettle back on, walked to the corridor, pulled 3 logs from the indoor wood wall, without bending more than a few steps from the cabin door, and came back inside to feed the stove. She sat down in Frank's rocking chair. She poured her tea. She looked at his photograph on the mantel, the one from 1987. The summer they finished the cabin's back porch, Frank in a white t-shirt with sawdust on both forearms, squinting into the afternoon sun with that particular expression of a man who has just made something with his hands and knows it is good. She said nothing to the photograph. She had never been the kind of woman who talked to photographs. She simply looked at it for a while, and then she looked at the fire, and then she looked at the window where the darkness outside was absolute and churning and hostile. And she thought about the whiteboard in the corridor with its 6 names and its 6 sets of notes. And she thought about the 6 cots rolled tight against the inner wall and she thought about the envelope she had walked to 6 mailboxes on a cold November morning. She had done what she could do. Now she waited. Half a mile down the ridge in the house that an architect in Missoula had described in its listing as a masterwork of contemporary mountain living, Clifton Hargrave was standing in his kitchen in the dark, listening to the sound of his generator not working. The Kohler standby unit had been installed the previous spring at a cost that Clifton had not found particularly notable, because there are categories of expense that become invisible once a person has enough money. It was supposed to activate automatically within 10 seconds of grid failure. He had heard it attempt to start the startup sequence, the gathering engine note, and then a sputter, a cough, and a mechanical silence that was immediately distinguishable from the silence of a machine that is simply not yet finished starting up. This was the silence of something that had stopped. He went to the mud room for his flashlight and his parka. The parka was a Himalayan expedition model designed for temperatures encountered at extreme altitude, and it had cost more than the generator. He pushed through the back door into the wind. The cold hit him with a physical force that he was not prepared for, despite the parka, despite the fleece underlayer, despite the insulated boots. It was not simply a matter of low temperature. It was the wind which stripped warmth from exposed skin, in the time it took to take a breath, which found every gap in his clothing. With the methodical efficiency of something that has been practicing this specific task since the beginning of geological time. He gasped. He bent forward against the pressure. He fought his way to the generator housing on the north side of the house. The regulator was a solid block of ice. He understood immediately and completely what had happened. Moisture had infiltrated the fuel line connection. The temperature drop had been too fast. The regulator had frozen before the unit could compensate. He understood it the way a litigator understands a case that has already been decided with full clarity and no recourse. He stood over the frozen machine with his flashlight beam and the wind trying to take the flashlight out of his hand, and he understood that there was no fix available to him in the next 30 seconds or the next 30 minutes. He went back inside. The house was already cooling. The cathedral ceiling 20 feet at the apex of the great room. His architect's proudest achievement. The feature every visitor had admired most was doing exactly what Meg Calloway's notes on the whiteboard had said it would do. Heat rises. In a room with a ceiling that high and no forced air circulating every BTU. The cabin had stored was pooling uselessly 30 feet above his head, while the cold, dense air settled to the floor like an invisible flood. He could already feel it on his feet through his boots. He stood in the center of his great room and watched his own breath cloud in the beam of the flashlight. He went to the wood pile on the east deck. He had approximately 1 cord of decorative firewood stacked on a wrought iron rack that had been chosen for its appearance against the cedar siding. It was outdoor stored, and the ice storm had arrived before the snow, which meant the logs were not merely snow-covered, but sealed in a continuous shell of clear ice, an inch thick. The individual logs fused together into one solid, immovable mass. He swung the ice axe from the tool shed. The blade skated off the surface and numbed his wrists. He swung again. The ice cracked, but the logs beneath it did not separate. He was still at the wood pile when he noticed the temperature reading on his phone's weather app 14 degrees Fahrenheit and still falling. Wind chill, advisory, -28. He put the phone in his pocket and stood in the dark and the horizontal sleet and looked at the frozen woodpile for a moment. And then he went back inside because there was nothing more to accomplish outside except damage. Inside, the ambient temperature in the great room had dropped to 41 degrees in the time he had been outside. He sat at the kitchen table in his parka and tried to think the way he thought through cases sequentially, without panic, identifying the central issue. The central issue was heat. He had no heat source that was currently operational. His firewood was inaccessible, his generator was frozen, his electric baseboard heaters, his radiant floor system, his forced air furnace, all of it was grid dependent, all of it was dead. The smart home system, whose battery backup he had drained by running the electric furnace for the first 2 hours of the outage, was showing 3% capacity on the small emergency panel. He opened the cabinet under the kitchen island, looking for something, candles, anything, and saw the envelope. It was white and sealed, and it was not his handwriting, and it was taped to the inside of the cabinet door at eye level, where he could not have missed it if he had opened this cabinet any time in the past 3 weeks. His name was written on the front in clean, precise handwriting that he recognized immediately. He opened it. The letter inside was a single page, handwritten on lined paper with numbered points and clear headings. He read it in the flashlight beam, his breath making small clouds around the words. It covered heat conservation, the specific failure modes of modern open plan architecture, in extreme cold, the critical danger of improvised heating in unventilated spaces. It told him how to identify hypothermia in himself before his judgment became too impaired to act. It told him where the manual shutoff for his water main was located, and that he should use it immediately to prevent pipe failure. At the bottom, underlined in the same clean, unornamented hand, if you're reading this, the grid is down, the light is on. Come up the ridge, Clifton. He stood in the dark kitchen for a long time. The wind outside struck the great room windows, floor to ceiling, 9 feet wide, double pane glass, that had been installed to showcase the valley view, and the glass shuttered in its frames. Somewhere deep in the house, a pipe groaned with the particular sound of water expanding inside metal that cannot expand to accommodate it. He thought about the whiteboard. He thought about the sentence she had said to him on the November afternoon when he had come to redirect her to smooth the situation to apply the reasonable pressure of a man accustomed to having his reasonableness prevail. I'm not building this for me, Clifton. He folded the letter carefully and put it in his parka pocket. He found his heaviest wool scarf and wrapped it twice around his face. He picked up the crowbar from the mud room, not as a weapon, but as a walking staff, something solid against the drifts. He put on a second pair of gloves over the first. He checked his flashlight battery. Then he pushed through the front door into the storm. 3/4 of a mile away, in the small one-story house at the north end of the Ridge Road, Orrin Briggs had been fighting the cold for 6 hours. He had known within an hour of the outage that he was in serious trouble. His house was heated entirely by electric baseboard units, no fireplace, no wood stove, no propane. He had sealed the bedroom door with towels and piled every blanket and coat he owned on the bed and climbed under them, and for the first 2 hours, that had been enough, or almost enough. But the cold had kept coming. The single pane north window, the one Meg's notes had flagged specifically, was running condensation that had frozen into crystalline webs of frost along the frame and was now beginning to creep down the wallpaper. The air in the bedroom was visible, not quite foggy, but thick enough that breathing it felt like drinking cold water rather than breathing. Orrin was 78 years old. His circulation had been a problem for 3 years, since the cardiologist in Missoula had put him on blood thinners and advised him with the diplomatic restraint of a doctor who wants to be listened to avoid prolonged cold exposure. His hands and feet lost warmth faster than a younger person's, and they recovered it more slowly. In an extreme cold, the process could become one-directional. His fingers had gone from cold to numb to a strange, heavy absence of sensation that he recognized with the methodical calm of a man who has dealt with emergencies before as the early stage of something that would not reverse itself without intervention. His lips felt thick and uncooperative when he tried to form words, though there was no one to say them to. His thoughts were coming slower, not confused exactly, but effortful. The way thoughts come when you are very tired, when the gap between intending to think something and actually thinking it has widened into a distance that requires crossing. He was very close to sleep. The last coherent thing he registered before Delphine Howell's face appeared in the frost rimmed frame of his bedroom door was the quality of the cold. Not sharp anymore, but soft, which was the wrong direction entirely. Which he knew was the wrong direction, which he could not seem to do anything about. Delphine had her own problems. The south fireplace in her house was everything Meg had said it would be, a decorative feature that had been installed by a previous owner with more interest in aesthetics than function. She had found this out definitively when she had tried to light a fire 90 minutes into the outage. The draw was reversed. The wind coming from the northwest at 60 miles per hour was running across the chimney cap and pulling air down the flue instead of up it. And the result of lighting kindling in a fireplace with a reverse draft was not warmth, but a room rapidly filling with dense, eye-stinging smoke that sent her out the front door coughing and gasping into the storm. She had tried twice more. The results were identical. She had wrapped herself in her winter coat and every sweater she owned, and had huddled on the couch under a pile of blankets and tried to sleep. And she had managed something close to it for an hour. And then she had gotten up because the temperature in the house had dropped to the point where sleep felt like a bad idea, like something she might not come back from cleanly. She had gone to check on Orrin because she was underneath the nosiness and the social commentary and the compulsive documentation of other people's lives. A person who showed up when showing up was necessary. She had crossed the road in the dark, and the wind bent her backward, and the sleet cut at her face above the scarf. And she had fought her way to his front door and knocked and entered and found him in the bedroom, barely responsive under his pile of blankets, with his lips the color of a late November sky. She had gotten him upright and conscious and moving just barely, just enough when the flashlight beam came around the bend in the ridge road. Clifton Hargrave appeared out of the storm like something dredged up from the bottom of a very cold sea, his face wrapped in wool, his expensive parka plastered with ice crystals, moving with the deliberate, effortful motion of a man who has been walking into a heavy wind for 20 minutes. He stopped when his flashlight found them on Orrin's front porch. He looked at Orrin's slack face and blue lips and Delphine's reddened, tear-streaked cheeks and did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Can he walk?" "Not well," Delphine said. Clifton looked up the ridge. The LED lights were visible through the driving snow, a faint, steady, amber-orange line running up the slope toward Meg's property, each small light separated from the next by about 6 feet, the whole line barely visible through the whiteout, but visible, steady, patient. He had missed them on his way down, or had not registered them, or had not been ready to register them. Now he could not look away from them. "She left us a trail," Delphine said, her voice cracked at the edges. Clifton looked at the lights for one more moment. Then he shifted the crowbar to his left hand, put his right arm under Orrin's left shoulder, and nodded at Delphine. They moved. The half mile up the ridge road in that storm was not something any of them would remember in sequential detail afterward. Memory requires a certain surplus of cognitive capacity to record experience properly, and that night, every available capacity was being consumed by the immediate totalizing work of moving forward. The wind came in lateral gusts that stopped them mid-step and required leaning into at angles that felt structurally wrong for a human body. The snow was thigh-deep in the drifts that crossed the road at intervals, and crossing each one meant lifting Orrin's weight and Delphine's weight and their own weight through resistance that did not yield without full commitment. Clifton lost sensation in his feet somewhere in the first quarter mile. He registered this fact and continued. There was no available alternative to continuing. Delphine stopped crying about halfway up. The cold had taken the tears before they could travel far enough to fall, and the crying itself required energy she could no longer spare, and she redirected everything into the next step, and the next step, and the one after that. Orin moved between them like a man navigating a dream, not unconscious but not fully present. Either his feet finding the ground with the automatic persistence of a body that is following an instruction it has been given too many times to override. Keep moving. That was the instruction. His feet followed it. The LED trail lights brought them up the last 100 yards. Without those lights and the total darkness of the whiteout, the driveway approach to Meg's property would have been invisible. The lights were solar charged, had been placed in the ground before the first hard frost, and were spaced precisely enough to be followed even in zero visibility conditions. They did not blink. They did not vary. They simply were what they were, a path laid down by a woman who had known with the undemonstrative certainty that comes from 42 years of paying attention that this path would be needed. The outer door of the fortress was in the corrugated tin wall of the south face, reinforced with a steel frame and fitted with a crossbar that seated into iron brackets. Clifton released Orin's weight onto Delphine, stepped forward, and hammered on the door with the flat of his fist. The wind swallowed it completely. He hammered again harder, and then he put his mouth close to the seam of the door and shouted Meg's name, and the wind took that too. Beside him, Delphine was losing the fight to hold Orin upright. The old man's knees were beginning to buckle in a slow, unavoidable way that gravity was winning. Clifton caught him under the arms, and all three of them went down together against the door, not falling exactly, but settling the way. Things settle when the effort required to remain upright exceeds the available fuel. Clifton put his bleeding knuckles against the rough wood one more time. He thought about the November afternoon, the whiteboard, the 6 names, the quiet, total certainty in a 67-year-old woman's voice when she said things that turned out to be exactly right. Meg. His voice was wrecked from the cold and the wind barely above a ragged whisper. I'm sorry. I should have listened. Please open the door. The iron latch clacked. The sound was unmistakable and immediate. Not tentative, not slow. The sound of a latch that has been kept oiled and in good working order because the person who installed it understood that a latch has a job to do and should be maintained in the condition required to do it. The door swung inward on its hinges. The warmth came first. Not a blast. A steady enveloping pressure of warm air, dense with the scent of pine resin and dry wood and wood smoke and something faintly herbal from the kitchen, rolling out through the open door and wrapping around the 3 people on the threshold with an immediacy that was almost incomprehensible after the past hour. Then the light, the amber, steady, unhurried light of a kerosene lantern held in a woman's hand. Margaret Calloway stood in the doorway of her corridor in her wool slippers and her flannel shirt, and Frank's old canvas work vest holding the lantern at shoulder height and looking down at the 3 of them with an expression that contained no triumph and no reproach, and no "I told you so." Her gray hair was pinned back neatly. Her face was calm and warm and entirely unsurprised. She looked at Orin first. She assessed him the way someone assesses a situation that requires immediate practical action quickly, thoroughly, without editorializing. Then she stepped back and held the door open wider. "Get inside," she said in the same even direct voice she used for everything, "before you let the cold in." They crossed the threshold. Clifton got Orin through the door first, and Delphine came after, and Clifton came last, and turned, and put his full weight against the door, and heard the solid, definitive sound of the crossbar dropping into its iron brackets, and the storm. All of it, the wind and the sleet and the cold and the darkness, and the 40 minutes of violence that had preceded this moment became a muffled, distant percussion against tin. Gone. Not gone, but removed, placed on the other side of something solid. Clifton stood with his back against the door and his eyes closed for a moment and just breathed. The air in the corridor was 55 degrees. He could feel it as a physical substance, something with weight and warmth, and the specific mercy of simply not being outside. The plank floor was dry under his boots. Overhead, the roof framing was solid and unmoving. Around him, rising from floor to ceiling, on the outer wall, the stacked cords of dry timber formed a barrier so dense and settled it felt geological, patient and permanent and certain in its purpose. He opened his eyes, and he saw what Meg Calloway had built. The corridor ran the full perimeter, 10 feet wide, 8 feet overhead, running in both directions from the south door until it disappeared around the corners of the cabin. The inner wall was the original cedar cabin, its logs tight and warm, radiating a steady background heat from the wood stove inside. The outer wall was the timber 10 cords of seasoned oak and fir, stacked with an exactness and density that made it look less like firewood and more like masonry. Along the inner wall, mounted in a row, were 6 canvas cots, military surplus, heavy, and practical. Each one rolled tight and stored with a sleeping bag and 2 wool blankets. Above them, carbon monoxide detectors blinked their steady green on the cabin logs. Below them, on a long folding table, were plastic storage totes labeled in the same clean handwriting as the letters rations, first aid, water, dry clothing. Beside the table, under its custom metal hood, the propane camp stove sat ready. Clifton counted the cots. 6. He looked at the folding table. He looked at the totes. He looked at the carbon monoxide detectors and the ventilation ports and the solar lanterns hanging at intervals along the ceiling beam. He turned slowly in the amber light, and somewhere in the turning, something that had been held very tightly in his chest for a very long time began without permission to release its grip. Meg was already working. She had Orrin on the nearest cot with 3 blankets over him and a foil-wrapped brick heated earlier on the wood stove, wrapped tight, pressed against the soles of his feet before Clifton had finished turning around. She was speaking to Orrin in a low, steady voice, telling him where he was and that the temperature here was safe and that he needed to stay awake, and her hands moved efficiently over the blankets, tucking the edges under, creating the thermal envelope that would begin reclaiming the heat his body had been losing for hours. She straightened up and turned to Clifton and Delphine. "Wet clothing comes off now," she said. "Both of you, hang everything on the line by the door. Dry flannel and wool in the green bin. Change your base layer's completely wet fabric against your skin. Will reverse everything I'm trying to do here." Delphine was crying in the quiet, exhausted way of someone who has finally stopped needing to be capable for a moment. She let Meg guide her to the green bin and stood there pulling wet wool over her head with the numb, cooperative obedience of a person who has completely run out of resistance. Clifton peeled off his gloves. His right hand was bleeding across 3 knuckles from the door. He looked at it for a moment impersonally, the way a person looks at a body part that belongs to a situation that is now over. Meg put a thermos in his other hand. He unscrewed the cap. The steam that came up was beef broth, dense and hot, and salt-rich in a way that the body recognizes as exactly what it needs before the mind has processed the decision to want it. He looked at her. She was already moving back toward Orrin, adjusting the blanket, checking his color. She moved through the corridor the way she moved through everything, without wasted motion, without performance, without any visible awareness that what she had built and what she had prepared and what she was doing right now was anything other than the natural consequence of having paid attention and acted on what attention revealed. Clifton wrapped both hands around the thermos. Outside, 300 feet beyond the tin wall, and the timber, and the dead air, and the cedar logs, the bomb cyclone was still running at full voice, 60-mile-per-hour, sustained winds, driving ice a temperature that was still falling toward its worst. It would not stop for 5 days. Inside the corridor, the lantern burned steady. The wood stove in the cabin beyond the inner wall ticked and breathed. Oren's color was coming back slowly at the edges, around the lips and jaw. The particular returning warmth of a body that has been given the conditions it needs and is choosing against the odds to use them. And Margaret Calloway moved through her corridor in her wool slippers, checking and adjusting and providing as the storm outside made its fullest possible argument against the value of preparation, and her fortress made its quiet, irrefutable, entirely silent reply. The first night inside the corridor, nobody slept well except Orrin Briggs. Orrin slept because his body demanded it, the deep recovery sleep of someone who has been pulled back from a threshold and needs time to process the return. He was warm within an hour of arriving, the color restored to his lips and jaw, his breathing settling into the slow, regular rhythm of true rest. Meg checked on him every 2 hours through the night, pressing 2 fingers lightly to the inside of his wrist, counting satisfied each time with what she found. By midnight, his pulse was steady and strong. By 2 in the morning, he had pushed one of the wool blankets off because he was too warm, which was the best possible sign. Clifton did not sleep. He sat on his cot with his back against the cedar cabin wall and his hands wrapped around a second cup of broth, and he looked at the corridor. He looked at the timber wall. He looked at the carbon monoxide detectors blinking their patient green above the cot line. He looked at the supply totes on the folding table, the labels, the neat stacking, the completeness of it. He looked at the propane stove under its custom exhaust hood, which Delphine had used to heat soup at 9 o'clock, before she finally fell into an exhausted sideways sleep, still in her borrowed flannel. He looked at all of it for a long time, the way a lawyer looks at evidence that overturns a case. He has already decided, not with resistance exactly, but with the particular effortful honesty required to revise a position that your own intelligence assembled. He had been very certain. That was the part he kept returning to. Not that he had been wrong. Being wrong was something he had made his peace with over a long career, because litigation teaches you that being right and being certain are not the same thing, and the gap between them is where most damage is done. What he could not stop examining was the quality of his certainty. How complete it had been. How comfortable. How it had required absolutely nothing of him, no attention, no revision, no discomfort, because the conclusion had been so easy, and the woman holding the contradictory evidence had been so easy to dismiss. A grieving widow, a hammer, an ugly shed. He had looked at those 3 things and arrived at an explanation that required him to learn nothing, and change nothing, and do nothing. And he had driven past her property for weeks, making that small contemptuous gesture with his thumb, and he had felt entirely justified, and he had been entirely wrong in a way that he now understood. Sitting in the warm, amber dark of what she had built could have killed him. Not metaphorically, literally. The temperature in his house by morning would be below 0. His pipes had almost certainly burst already. Without this corridor, without this woman's preparation, without those LED lights running up the driveway that he had followed like a man following the only light in a very dark place, he would have sat in his freezing great room in his expensive expedition parka and managed the situation with great competence right up until he couldn't anymore. He sat with that for a long time. Outside, the storm ran on a sustained, full-throated roar that came and went in waves against the tin, each gust arriving like a fist, each receding into the low bass note of continuous wind. Inside, the corridor held. The temperature at floor level was 56 degrees. The wood stove in the cabin beyond the inner wall breathed and ticked. The lantern on its ceiling hook burned with the steady, undemanding patience of a thing that has been given good fuel and a proper wick. At some point in the early hours of the morning, Clifton slept. The second day arrived as a slight, grudging brightening of the plexiglass light panels near the roof line. Not sunlight, just the theoretical existence of daytime, somewhere above the overcast and the driving snow. Meg was up before any of it was visible, banking the stove and checking ventilation ports and walking the corridor perimeter with a lantern, running her hand along the base of the timber wall, at intervals checking for any cold air intrusion at the foundation line. There was none. She put the kettle on and started oatmeal on the propane stove, and by the time the others were stirring, she had breakfast on the table and had already pulled that morning's fuel from the indoor wood wall, a half dozen oak rounds, and fed the stove without once opening an exterior door. Jasper and Nora Whitfield knocked on the outer door at 7:40 in the morning. Meg heard the knock and crossed to the door and lifted the crossbar and opened it, and there they were. The two young people from the bottom of the ridge, ice-covered and exhausted, and clearly having spent a very bad night somewhere that was not as bad as it could have been. Jasper's car had slid into the drainage ditch off the county road the previous afternoon, and they had sheltered in it for the first hours of the storm before understanding that the car was losing heat faster than they could manage. Nora had found the letter in her coat pocket, the one from the November envelope, which she had kept because she was a practical person, and they had read it by the car's interior light and started moving. They had reached Meg's property by following the LED trail lights in the dark. Meg looked at them both for one moment, assessing as she always assessed, quickly and completely. And then she stepped back and held the door open. "Come in," she said. "There's oatmeal." That was 6, the last two names on the whiteboard. Meg did not say this out loud. She simply closed the door behind them, seated the crossbar, and went back to the stove to add 2 more portions to the pot. Clifton watched the young couple come in. He watched Nora, who was, it turned out, an ER nurse from the Missoula hospital, who had moved to the ridge when she and Jasper married, immediately and, without being asked, go to check on Orrin. He watched Jasper look around the corridor with the wide, taking-in expression of someone encountering something that exceeds their existing framework for what is possible. He watched Meg move through it all with the calm efficiency of someone running a well-designed system, which was exactly what this was. He thought she planned for all of them before any of this started. She built for all of them. The days found their rhythm. Meg organized it not with commands, not with the kind of explicit delegation that announces itself, but with the quiet, authoritative competence of someone who knows what needs doing and trusts that people with working hands will do it when it becomes clear. Within the first morning, without being assigned to anything, Clifton had found the hand axe in the corridor's tool rack and was splitting kindling inside the protected perimeter, the rhythmic work warming him and filling the fuel box beside the stove. Delphine, who turned out to have a practical domestic capability that her social persona had entirely obscured, was managing the rations with focused economy, stretching the stew base, rationing the propane, keeping track of what had been used and what remained with the same systematic attention she applied to library acquisitions. Orrin, recovering faster than anyone had expected, appointed himself keeper of the lanterns and the dry goods, moving slowly between the supply totes with the methodical care of a man who understands that small things maintained with consistency prevent large problems. Nora monitored everyone's health with a professional quietness that was deeply reassuring. She checked Orrin twice, daily, watched Clifton's knuckles for infection, made sure everyone was eating enough and drinking water. Jasper, who was a carpenter by trade, found a section of the outer tin walls lower flashing, that the wind had begun to work loose on the second day, and spent 2 hours in the corridor securing it with extra screws from Meg's supply bin, never mentioning it to anyone until Meg found him finishing the last fastener and nodded once in the way that was her version of a standing ovation. The storm outside made its arguments continuously. The wind found every pitch and frequency available to it. The temperature outside on the second night dropped to 18 below zero. Meg knew this from the outdoor thermometer probe she had run through a sealed port in the outer wall, its readout visible on a small display inside the corridor. 18 below, with a wind chill that the radio, when it briefly worked on Meg's hand crank emergency receiver, reported as equivalent to 40 below. Inside the corridor, 54 degrees at floor level, 62 at shoulder height. Inside the cabin, through the inner door, 70 degrees. The dead airspace was performing exactly as it was designed to perform, as a thermal buffer absorbing the murderous cold of the exterior before it could reach the cabin walls, maintaining a microclimate that made the difference between survival and the alternative. The timber wall was doing what dense, dry hardwood does at extreme cold. It was acting as a thermal mass, absorbing and slowly releasing the slight warmth radiating from the cabin, moderating the temperature in the corridor with a patience that no mechanical system could have matched, because no mechanical system could have functioned in those conditions. On the third evening after supper, when the others had settled Orrin and Delphine asleep, Jasper and Nora quiet on their cots with a lantern between them, Meg sat in the corridor's single wooden chair, the one she had brought out from the cabin kitchen, and Clifton sat on the edge of his cot across from her, and the two of them were alone in the amber light, with the storm doing its work outside and the lantern doing its work inside. He had been carrying the question for 2 days. He had turned it over the way you turn a stone in your hand, feeling its weight and edges, deciding whether to set it down or throw it. He set it down. "Why didn't you just tell us, Meg?" His voice was quiet, hoarse, from 2 days of dry air and smoke. "Come to us directly. Sit us down. We might have listened." Meg looked at the lantern flame for a long time without answering. Then she stood up and crossed to the inner cabin door and opened it. And the warmth of the cabin's interior rolled out into the corridor in a slow, visible wave. She went inside for a moment. Clifton heard a drawer open and close. She came back out with something in her hand. A single piece of paper folded in thirds. The paper yellowed and softened at the creases in the way of something handled many times over many years. She held it out to him. He unfolded it carefully. It was a hand-drawn diagram pencil on graph paper, precise and detailed in the way of someone who drew with the same methodical care they applied to everything. It showed a cabin floor plan with a surrounding perimeter structure labeled at intervals with measurements and materials. Insulation calculations in the margins. Timber quantity estimates. A note about vapor barrier placement, another about ventilation requirements. In the bottom right corner, in Frank Calloway's handwriting, Clifton had seen it once on a property boundary note Frank had left in his mailbox years ago, and he recognized the particular upright, unhurried quality of it was a date and a sentence. The date was 3 years before Frank died. The sentence read, "When the big one comes, they won't listen until they have to. Build it anyway, Meg. Build it for them." Clifton held the paper in both hands and read it twice. The lantern flame moved slightly in a breath of air from somewhere. He thought about the man who had written this, Frank Calloway, whom he had known as the quiet neighbor who waved from the chopping block and brought firewood to Orrin Briggs every November, and never came to parties and never sought attention, and had apparently 3 years before his death sat down with graph paper and pencil and designed a structure to protect his neighbors from a winter he knew was coming and also knew they would not prepare for. Not because they were bad people, because they were the kind of people they were, and he had known exactly what kind of people they were, and he had loved them anyway. And he had trusted Meg to build what he had designed, knowing that she was the only one who would. Clifton looked up. Meg was watching him with the clear, still attention she turned on everything that mattered. "He knew us," Clifton said. The words came out quieter than he intended and rougher. "He knew this valley," Meg said. "He knew what 40 winters looked like and what they could do and what people were likely to do about them." She took the paper back gently and folded it along its old creases. "He wasn't wrong about any of it." "No," Clifton said. "He wasn't." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who have arrived by very different routes at the same piece of ground and are standing on it together for the first time. Meg went back inside the cabin. The door closed quietly. The lantern continued its steady work. Outside, the storm ran on into its fourth night, and the timber wall held, and the dead air held, and the temperature in the corridor held at 55 degrees, and Clifton Hargrave sat on the edge of his cot for a long time after that, in the amber quiet, holding a cup that had gone cold, not drinking it, not moving, simply sitting with the particular stillness of a man who has been revised. On the morning of the fifth day, the wind stopped. It did not taper, it did not diminish gradually in the way that would have allowed a person to track the change. It simply stopped between one moment and the next. The sustained roaring that had been the sonic background of their entire existence for 4 days was gone, replaced by a silence so complete and so sudden that everyone in the corridor woke at the same moment, or nearly drawn up out of sleep by the absence of something rather than the presence. They lay in their cots and listened to the silence. It lasted for a long time. Then, from somewhere far down the valley, came a sound that was entirely different from everything they had heard for 5 days. A deep, mechanical diesel note, steady and purposeful, moving slowly upward through the gears as it climbed grade. The sound of an engine doing its job. Clifton was at the outer door first. He lifted the crossbar. It moved easily, as it had every time properly maintained in its brackets, and pushed the door outward against the drift that had formed against it overnight. The drift gave after a moment's resistance, and cold air came in, and then light. Real light, morning light, flat and blue-white, reflecting off 4 feet of undisturbed snow that covered every surface of the visible world in a clean, unbroken layer that had the quality of something that has been laid down by a process indifferent to human concerns and is entirely beautiful because of it. The sky above was a pale washed blue, the specific blue that follows extreme weather, scoured clean of everything transparent all the way to space. The others came to the door behind him. Orrin, moving carefully but steadily on his own feet, his color fully restored. Delphine, her eyes wide and wet in the cold, clean air. Jasper and Nora, side by side, Nora's hand in Jasper's coat pocket. And Meg, last, who stepped through the door and stood in the snow in her canvas work boots, with her face turned up to the cold sky, the way you turn your face up to the first warmth of spring, just receiving it simply without performance. The diesel sound grew louder. Colt Dawson's county plow was an orange Peterbilt with a 12-foot blade and a spreader rig on the back, and it came up the ridge road like a ship, through white water, the blade throwing great curving wakes of snow to either side, the engine note dropping and climbing with the effort of cutting through drifts that had packed to the density of wet concrete. Colt had been running routes since 4 in the morning. The Ridge Road was his last and highest and most difficult, and he had saved it for full daylight. He stopped the rig at the entrance to the Hargrove property first. He climbed down from the cab and stood looking at the house for a moment, and what he saw was what the storm had done to a structure that had not been prepared for what the storm was. The floor to ceiling great room windows had not broken. They were too well engineered for that, but the thermal failure had been total. Ice had formed on the interior surfaces of the glass, thick and opaque, turning the expensive view framing windows into white walls. The decorative wood pile on the east deck was still a solid fused block, still unburned. One section of the cedar shake roof on the north face had taken ice damage, the shakes lifting and splitting under the freeze-thaw cycling of the storm's temperature swings. The outdoor smart home weather station mounted on a post near the driveway had simply stopped functioning and hung at an angle where the wind had pushed it. Colt walked the perimeter of the Hargrove house with the practiced eye of a man who had seen storm damage for 20 years. He made notes on the clipboard he carried. He estimated the repair costs in the professional conservative way of someone who understands that first estimates are always low. Then he drove the plow up the ridge to Meg's property. He parked on the shoulder and climbed down and stood looking at the structure. The outer shell of corrugated tin and reclaimed wood, the reinforced door in the south face, the chimney running clean smoke in a thin straight line into the blue sky above. He had heard about this project. Half the county had heard about it. He had formed an opinion about it from a distance the way most people had, based on the description of what it looked like, rather than any direct knowledge of what it was. He was revising that opinion in real time. He raised his fist to knock on the outer door. It opened before his knuckles made contact. And there, filling the doorway with borrowed flannel and 4 days of indoor living, and the particular look of someone who has been through something real and come out the other side of it, was Clifton Hargrave. Colt stared at him. Behind Clifton, in the amber corridor light, Colt could see the others, Orrin upright and alert, Delphine, a mug in both hands, Jasper and Nora, and at the back, moving between the supply totes with the same unhurried efficiency she had maintained for 5 days, Margaret Calloway. Colt took his hat off. It was an unconscious gesture, the kind that bypasses the decision-making process entirely and comes directly from somewhere older and more reliable. "Everyone's okay," he said. "Everyone's okay," Clifton said. Colt looked past him at the corridor, the timber wall, the cots, the supply totes, the lanterns. He took it in the way a practical man takes in practical things, which is to say, completely and without condescension, and with the direct, evaluating attention of someone who understands what he's looking at. "How long were you in here?" Colt asked. 5 days, Clifton said. Clifton. Colt nodded slowly. He looked at Meg, who had stopped moving and was standing near the inner cabin door with a lantern in her hand, watching him. He held her gaze for a moment. "Ma'am," he said with the hat still off. Meg nodded once. The practical work of recovery took the rest of the morning. Colt plowed the ridge road to its full width and opened the driveways. The county emergency management team arrived mid-morning with 2 SUVs and a medical unit, and Nora back in professional mode the moment the option existed, coordinated with the EMTs to ensure Orrin was properly evaluated, which he passed with the slightly impatient cooperation of a man who considers extended medical attention unnecessary, but understands that arguing with nurses is a project without a favorable outcome. Clifton walked with one of the emergency management officers down to his house. He stood on his front porch and looked through the ice-opaque great room windows. He opened the front door and went inside and stood in his kitchen, which was 31 degrees Fahrenheit, and looked at the cracked Italian marble toilet visible through the open bathroom door and the burst section of copper pipe under the kitchen sink where water had frozen and expanded with more force than the joint could resist, and the frost patterns on the interior walls, the crystalline webs of ice that had colonized his expensive finishes with complete indifference to their cost. He stood there for a while, then he walked back up the ridge to Meg's property where the others were beginning to gather their borrowed things and prepare to leave. And he found Meg in the corridor doing the inventory she had been keeping throughout, noting what had been used, what remained, what would need to be restocked. She was writing in a small notebook with the same clean, spare handwriting she used for everything, and she did not stop writing when he came in, which he had expected, because Meg Calloway had never performed attentiveness she did not feel. He stood near the supply table and watched her write for a moment. "The house is going to need significant work," he said. "I know," she said without looking up. "The pipes, the roof section on the north face, the generator regulator." He paused. "The woodpile situation." Meg turned a page in her notebook. "Covered storage on the north side," she said. "Stack against the south-facing wall if you can. Leave the top course accessible in rain or snow." She turned another page. "And get the regulator housing insulated before next fall. It's a $20 fix." Clifton absorbed this. He looked at the timber wall, which had done its work for 5 days, without a single failure, every log exactly where Meg had placed it, still dry, still dense, still holding the cold at the distance she had determined was safe. "The letter you left in my cabinet," he said. Meg looked up. "I opened it during the first hour of the outage," he said. "Before I went outside. I read it in the flashlight beam." He paused. "I went outside and tried to break the firewood apart anyway." Meg looked at him for a moment. "I know," she said. "Because I needed to try it myself first," he said, "before I could follow someone else's directions." "I know that too," she said. There was no edge in it. It was the same clear, unhurried delivery she applied to everything, direct and honest, and entirely without cruelty. "That's why I wrote it down, so it would be there when you were ready to read it." Clifton looked at her. Something moved through his expression. Something that didn't have a precise name in the vocabulary of a man who had spent 30 years being the most prepared person in any professional room. A rearrangement, a settling the specific look of a conviction, being gently but permanently retired. He picked up one of the oak rounds from the fuel box beside the inner door. He set it on the splitting block Meg had placed in the corridor for indoor use. He picked up the hand axe. "Show me how you split these for the stove," he said. "The right way." Meg set down her notebook. She came over and stood beside him. She adjusted his grip on the axe handle 2 inches down from where he'd held it, which changed the leverage entirely. She showed him the grain line to follow. She showed him the angle of entry. She stepped back. He split the round cleanly on the first stroke. She went back to her notebook. He split another. The morning moved on. One by one, the others said their goodbyes. Oren, slowly and warmly, shaking Meg's hand in both of his, and holding it for a long moment, without words, which was his way. Delphine, with tears that she made no effort to conceal, which was new and which looked better on her than the composure usually did. Jasper, with a handshake that turned briefly into something closer to an embrace, and Nora, with the direct practical gratitude of a medical professional who understands what the alternative outcome would have been and does not minimize it. Each of them paused at the outer door and looked back at the corridor, the timber wall, the cots, the supply table, the lanterns, as if trying to memorize it, or trying to understand it, or trying to carry something of it with them that would survive the walk back down the ridge to the ordinary world. Clifton was last. He stood at the outer door with his coat on his hands, in his gloves, the borrowed flannel returned to the dry clothing bin, his own things restored to him by the winter morning outside. He looked back at Meg, who was already pulling the cots back to their stored positions with the same methodical efficiency she had maintained from the beginning. The corridor was beginning to look like what it would be after they were gone, a space that had done its work and would wait quietly until it was needed again. He wanted to say something that was adequate to the situation. He was a man who dealt in language professionally, who had spent 30 years finding the precise combination of words that would carry the weight of an argument across a courtroom and into the minds of 12 strangers and make them understand something they had not understood before. He could not find the words. He took his hat off instead. "Meg," he said. She stopped and looked at him. He held her gaze. He did not drop it, and he did not look away, and he did not offer the managed, calibrated expression of a man presenting a considered position. He just looked at her with the full, undefended attention of a person who is finally simply looking. He put his hat back on. He turned and walked out the door into the blue Montana morning. The door closed behind him, the crossbar seated in its brackets. Meg stood in the corridor alone. The lantern burned. The wood stove breathed beyond the inner wall. The temperature held 55 degrees of still, dry, patient air, enclosed and undisturbed, doing exactly what dead air does when you give it the proper container. She walked the perimeter slowly, the way she had walked it every day, running her hand along the face of the timber, checking the base of the outer wall, confirming the ventilation ports. Everything was exactly as it should be. Everything was exactly as she had built it to be. At the inner cabin door, she paused. She went inside. The cabin was warm and amber lit, and exactly as it had always been. The wood stove, the rocking chair, the kitchen with its copper pots, and the antique barometer hanging on its nail beside the coat rack. The needle now rising slow and steady back toward the range that meant what it had always meant, out here in the mountains, in the weather, in the long, unforgiving, beautiful winter. She crossed to the mantel. Frank's photograph was there, the one from 1987, the summer they finished the back porch, white t-shirt and sawdust, and squinting into afternoon light, with the expression of a man who has made something with his hands and knows it is good. Meg looked at it for a long time. Outside, through the cabin's western window, the sky above the Crestfall Ridge was the clear, deep, laundered blue of a world. After a storm, the particular blue that means it is over, that the worst has passed, that the held breath of 5 days has finally been released into the cold, bright, ordinary air of a December morning in Montana. The chimney smoke rose straight up from the cabin roof into that blue, thin and white and steady, the way smoke rises when the fire below it is well built and properly fed and burning clean. Meg sat down